97063 and text these plot names to that number, and it'll automatically sign you up for our text message line. And you should then receive a reminder about these meetings here coming up. So I'll give you just a little more time to do that. Another thing, so the CCA credits for this one have not come through yet, not that they won't. I do expect them to here fairly soon. But for today, guys, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go into the chat function on Zoom, and you're going to need to send me your first name, last name, and CCA number. I would recommend finding my name under that chat feature so you're not texting to the entire group, but put in your first name, last name, and CCA credit number. Now, having said that, if you leave before the end is up, you will not get credit. I'm just trying to stay ahead of it here. And once you leave the chat feature here, I won't be able to see that. So make sure you're staying till the end, which is required anyway. But you have to do your first name, last name, and CCA number in the chat feature to me to get credit. And you can send that at any time. Okay. So again, make sure you're signed up under our text line. And I can put this up at the end again if you need it. Don't do message. That's just this is what you're typing there. So type the name of the plot and send it to 97063. Okay. So this is a continuation of what we started on last week. We started in on plant nutrition. Now, with those, if you guys did miss last week and you want to go back and redo and look at that section, we have sent out all of the recordings, and we actually sent out the PowerPoint as well. So we did send that out to our team here at Winfield United. So talk to your local Winfield United rep, and they can forward that to you at any time. So if you need that, just ask your local Winfield United rep in the area. Okay. But as we continue, you know, we discussed a lot on some of the basics of plant nutrition last week. This week, we're going to start in talking about specific nutrients. And for this week, we're going to talk specifically about nitrogen. Now, the reason we spend so much time talking about nitrogen is it is one of the most important nutrients that we deal with. Okay. It's important in the production of proteins. It's important in the production of productions of enzymes that are required to build the cell. It's also really important in chlorophyll as well. If you don't have chlorophyll, of course, you run out of energy there to produce sugars. Okay, now the interesting thing about nitrogen is the air is actually made up of about 78% nitrogen. Unfortunately, it's in a form that is unusable by the plant. And if we could utilize that nitrogen, we'd have about 35,000 tons per acre. Unfortunately, though, it is unavailable. Now, certain plants can, in fact, fix nitrogen. You look at soybeans, for example. The soybean itself, though, is not fixing the nitrogen. What it does is it forms a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria in the soil called the rhizobium bacteria. And the soybeans provide the bacteria with sugars, and the bacteria then take atmospheric nitrogen, N2 gas, and they convert it over to a usable form that the plant can utilize. Okay, now that's true of all legumes. So alfalfa, soybeans, peanuts, all of those legume type crops. However, some people have tried to do this with corn. And unfortunately, to date, we haven't found a really effective way to get corn to fix its own nitrogen. Now, there's products out there that claim that they can do that. I haven't seen enough data necessarily to support those claims. In fact, a lot of them I've seen have been very variable. It's an interesting concept, but unfortunately, guys, it takes a fair amount of energy to fix nitrogen, and that energy has to come from somewhere. And so for corn, where it doesn't have that symbiotic relationship, the likelihood of us being able to do that, to be able to fix its own nitrogen, is still probably a ways out. We haven't quite figured out how to do that. Now, the nitrogen cycle in itself is very complex. Okay, there's all of these additions, all of these subtractions, mobilization, immobilization. It is very complex, and it's probably one of the most complex nutrients that we deal with. Okay, there's a couple different forms that nitrogen can be in the soil. We can either have it in the ammonium form, which is a positively charged form, or the nitrate form. And there's quite a few different ways that we can lose nitrogen. There's quite a few different ways we can put more nitrogen in the system. Now, the characteristics between ammonium and nitrate. Ammonium is a positively charged ion, sticks to the soil fairly well. Nitrate has the potential for leaching. Darren's going to do a demonstration a little bit later to kind of show you how that works. But I think what's more important here, ammonium in general is the preferred method by which the plant would prefer to take up nitrogen. However, what we can show is that very little of the nitrogen is actually taken up in the ammonium form. And it's because of this complex cycle that we don't get as much ammonium nitrogen in the plant, because what ends up happening, guys, is this ammonium is connected onto that soil particle and is on that cation exchange capacity. Now, we talked about cation exchange capacity last week, in which case what we were doing is those cations were constantly exchanging with the soil water. Remember back to Darren's demonstration around the celery stalks, right? It takes water and nutrients to get good uptake. You can't have just water, you can't have just nutrients. You have to have both. Part of the reason why is because, for example, this ammonium will exchange off of that exchange site into that soil water. Well, at that point, then it's free game to be either taken up by the plant, or it could be nitrified and formed into nitrate. And oftentimes, I think what happens, and the reason we don't see as much nitrogen be taken up in the ammonium form, is because oftentimes the bacteria is a lot more plentiful than our roots. And so what we end up with then is ammonium being converted to nitrate and the plant taken up that way. In fact, and I'll show you this slide later, about 98% of our nitrogen is actually taken up in the nitrate form. Okay. There's plenty other additions. We'll go through. I'm going to spend some time going through additions, and then Darren is going to end up spending the rest of the time going through some of the loss mechanisms. Okay, nitrogen deficiency is really easy to see. Here's some on small grains or wheat here, and then corn. You got that V-shaped pattern. We rarely see it on alfalfa or soybeans, but I have seen nitrogen deficiencies on soybeans, for example, that haven't nodulated. Okay, it's just not as common. Okay, and I always get the question on nitrogen for soybeans, should I be applying a little bit extra nitrogen, especially if I'm in that high yield situation? Guys, I haven't necessarily found very good repeatability in doing that. Now, can I get some bushel bump from time to time? Yeah, but the repeatability of it is only like 25%. So it's more difficult to do that. If you're looking at supplying some extra nitrogen, what I would look at instead is using something like an ammonium sulfate. Okay, because that sulfur piece, I think, is one thing that we do miss on soybeans, especially high yielding soybeans. Okay, and I've seen some success with sulfur being used in the AMS form. Some people are trying to do it ahead of time, right ahead of planting. And that seems to be okay, a little bit better in a drier year, it seems like. However, people are really having success with it, are putting it on in that R1 to R2 time period, spread over top of those soybeans. Okay, but here's our nitrogen deficiency on corn. Now, nitrogen's interesting in the fact that it's taken up mainly during that grand growth stage. And in fact, if you look at when a majority of our nitrogen is taken up, 75% of nitrogen is taken up before tassel, and almost 80% of that is taken up from about V8 till tassel here. It's right in this section. So the most important thing with nitrogen is to try to get as much available during that time as we possibly can. In fact, when you look at 308 bushel corn, we need to have 11 pounds of nitrogen per day per acre from about V12 to tassel. So it's extremely important to get as much nitrogen available during that time period as I can. Now that begs the question, well, when should we put on, for example, our side dress applications? Okay, if I look at this chart, it would suggest that, hey, that V10 time period should be a pretty decent time to put on my nitrogen. And I would say it is if you can get a rain right after that application, or if you have a pivot irrigation or some sort of irrigation in your system. However, for those of us that don't have that, I generally recommend my side dress applications between V4 and V6. Okay, and the reason why is I need that to get it into the soil and get into the plant. And unfortunately, that does take time to do that. Okay, and so to reduce the amount of risk that you have, I generally recommend going at between V4 to V6 and making your application then. Plus, even if I'm just a little bit late from that V4 to V6 time period, I still haven't missed that grand growth period where I need all of that nitrogen to be available. Okay, and so that's generally the reason why I put more of that into that system from that V4 to V6 time period rather than later in the season. Okay. Now, when you look at how nitrogen is taken up, again, nitrogen is taken up 98% of the time through mass flow. Okay, you can see the other 2%, which would be in the ammonium form, the plant's just running into it. Okay, so this is why, even though the plant would prefer to take it up in the ammonium form, and that is 100% accurate because the plant will actually have to convert it back to ammonium to move it within the plant. However, it's just not very efficient for that plant to take it up through mass or through diffusion or root intercept. It's much more efficient for that plant to take it up with the water through mass flow. Okay, so nitrate is not necessarily a bad thing. The key is with nitrate is we have to get it available when the plant actually needs it. If we can't get it available when the plant needs it, that's when we start to see those nitrogen deficiencies. Now, as far as additions, we get about 7 to 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre every year through fixing of lightning. Okay, so not a lot, but this is also the reason why your grass will generally green up more after a rainfall than if we were to just put on water through some sort of irrigation. Okay, we get about 7 to 10 pounds, and it's because lightning in the atmosphere will heat up the air enough to actually fix nitrogen. So it's much the same as the way that we make nitrogen fertilizer through heat and pressure. That's the exact same way that nitrogen is fixed through lightning as well. Okay, we also get some nitrogen through mineralization. The higher your organic matter, the higher your mineralization will be. So for example, if we have 5% organic matter and we have 2% mineralization rate, we're going to have about 132 pounds of nitrogen available for that crop for that year. Okay, now there's a lot of different factors in this, guys, and we try to predict this as best we can. And personally, I would actually argue if you guys are using the field forecasting tool from Winfield, it is probably one of the closest mineralization predictors that I've seen. Now, is it 100% accurate? No, but it does do a fairly good job of identifying and modeling out how much nitrogen will be mineralized for that specific year. Okay. Generally, I found that the farther north that we go, we're closer to this 1%. Unless it gets fairly warm, then we can get up to 1.5 to 2%. The farther south I go, I'm getting closer to that 2% mineralization rate. Okay, so that gives you a few, at least an idea of how much. Now, for the most part, guys, a lot of people, when they're making nitrogen recommendations, don't pay a lot of attention to mineralization because, first of all, we don't know how much will actually become available. And second of all, it's generally figured into those nitrogen recommendations. But, you know, as we start looking into the future and starting, especially with where nitrogen prices are today, and trying to figure out what the nitrogen, the best nitrogen rate will be and the most economical nitrogen rate, these tools like the field forecasting tool, for example, will become more and more important. And guys, the field forecasting tool is not one that you want to do with every farmer. Okay, first of all, not every farmer is going to appreciate that. Some of them could care less. It's those more progressive growers that are looking for more information. Those are the ones that I would recommend getting a few fields in on that field forecasting tool, because it is really cool to see what your nitrogen recommendations, what that nitrogen is doing. Now, remember, it's not an easy button, so you still have to make adjustments in season, take a tissue sample, those type of things. But guys, it really does add some value to those very progressive growers. Okay, other nitrogen additions, we have legume plants. So alfalfa is one of our biggest one, and I would just pay attention to this corn side of things. And we'll send this PowerPoint out as well. Alfalfa, 5 or more square foots per plant. So this is a key indication, guys. If you go out there and, well, this is my alfalfa field from last year, what's my nitrogen credit? And you can't find an alfalfa plant, probably not going to provide any nitrogen. Okay, but if you got 2 to 4, which is generally when we start taking alfalfa out, you're going to get about 40 to 60. If you have a really good alfalfa stand, even at the end there, you can take 120 to 140 pounds of nitrogen credit. Okay, with soybeans, it's going to be anywhere from 15 up to 50 pounds. Generally, what we look at is we actually look at the bushels per acre from the previous year, but I'm going to tell you that tops out at 50. Okay, don't go over 50. And really, guys, it has nothing to do with the soybean just leaving more nitrogen. It has everything to do with the fact that soybeans have a very low carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so as that residue is being broken down, we actually get more nitrogen available. And this study really did a nice job of showing how that works. So for example, here's our nitrogen rate, corn after corn bushels per acre, corn after soybeans, and then corn after wheat. You can see the corn after corn suffered a lot more than the corn after soybeans here, and it's because of that nitrogen credit. Okay. Manure. So manure applications, and I know that Darren's going to talk a little bit about manure applications, but this is one of the most underutilized nitrogen sources that we have. Okay, they literally see it as just a waste product, which is it's really sad because it has such a high value, especially when you start looking at hog manure here. You got liquid swine manure down here. Now, this is an average, but I've seen this number for nitrogen up to 70 pounds per 1,000 gallons. Okay, most of it's hovering in that 40 to 60, but some of it can be as high as 70 pounds of nitrogen. Guys, when we look at this, we need to protect this nitrogen because, especially liquid swine manure, 70% of liquid swine manure is in the ammonium form. Okay, so think of when we put on anhydrous ammonia. What anhydrous ammonia does is it immediately connects onto water. It immediately forms NH4. Now, we do a great job at protecting our ammonium nitrogen in the form of anhydrous, right? We use a lot of N-Serve. We use a lot of nitrogen stabilizers with our anhydrous applications. But one thing you have to consider, guys, 70% of swine manure is in the exact same form as what that anhydrous ammonia is. And we do a terrible job of protecting that swine manure. Okay, we need to do a better job at that. Okay, and I know a lot of us, we focus on fall fertilizer. That's great. We don't often focus on these guys that have manure, but this is an opportunity for a lot of you to get out and make sure that we're addressing these. Okay, now some of you might wonder, okay, organic nitrogen, how much of that is going to be available? Because 70% of liquid swine manure is going to be available in the first year. How much of that liquid swine manure in the organic nitrogen form is going to be available? So we go down here, liquid manure, we get about 30% of that liquid manure, of that organic nitrogen to mineralize. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to take 30% times 30% here. And when we do that, we get about 9% available. Okay. And so we add that in here. So we're at about 79% of swine manure is going to be available in that particular year. Does that make sense? So we're sitting just below 80% of swine manure to be available. That 30%, it might be easier to look at this on a 100-pound basis, for example. So of the 100 pounds of nitrogen that you're getting in a hog manure application, 70 pounds of that would be available. 30% would be in the organic form. Of that 30% of that will mineralize in the first year. So you take 30% or 30 pounds times 30%, you get an additional 9 pounds. So of that 100 pounds of nitrogen, we'd expect 79% or 79 pounds to be available in the particular year if you're stabilizing and if you're getting enough available to that plant. Okay, now when we look at fertilizers, all of our fertilizers start as anhydrous ammonia, and it starts through this Haber-Bosch process is what it's called. Basically, we use heat and pressure and a catalyst to form anhydrous ammonia. And this is why anhydrous ammonia is generally the cheapest form of nitrogen. And that's because of the fact that with anhydrous ammonia, we use anhydrous ammonia to make all of the other forms of nitrogen. So in order to make urea, we would combine it with carbon dioxide to form urea. If we want to make ammonium nitrate, we combine it with nitric oxide in the prilling tower to make ammonium nitrate, which, by the way, is very explosive. So that's why we don't see a lot of ammonium nitrate on the market. However, we can use that ammonium nitrate and the urea and combine it to make UAN. Okay, this is why UAN generally is the more expensive version of nitrogen, is because of the fact that the urea and the ammonium nitrate is combined to make UAN. Okay, now when we look at anhydrous ammonia will expand 4 inches from the knife injection point. So I often get questions, well, how quickly can I plant after I make a nitrogen application? Guys, first of all, it's going to depend on depth. Some of these high-speed bars do not get it deep enough to really do a good job in the spring of getting it deep enough to protect that seedling. Okay. It will spread about 4 inches. So we need to make sure we're getting it at a good depth. And that's going to be really important this year with how dry our soils are. This is going to be a year where we're going to have to make sure we're maintaining a good depth and getting a good seal. Because if we're too dry, we might not get a good enough seal behind the behind that closing wheel to not allow that anhydrous to escape. If it's too shallow, too wet, too high of rate for a soil, generally, guys, this is more of a concern out in parts of Nebraska where they have those sugar sands. But in general, as a rule of thumb, for every 1 part per million, or sorry, for every 1 CEC, you can hold about 10 pounds of nitrogen. Okay, and that's true up until you get to about 10. Once you get above 10, guys, generally, I don't see too much of an issue with overloading the soil with anhydrous ammonia. Okay, anhydrous ammonia, although it does kill bacteria at the injection point, those bacteria within 10 days come back very, very quickly. And anhydrous ammonia does not have an effect on bulk density either. Okay. Make sure to allow enough time. I like to put about 7 to 10 days between when I make the application and when I plant, because it's not uncommon for us to see burnt off roots. This is a great, this is from a call I went on a couple years ago. You can see that burnt off root that we get with anhydrous ammonia. So be careful with that. Okay. Other forms, we got urea, which is just a dry product. You guys are familiar with this. It's 46% nitrogen. Do not place any urea form directly in contact with seed. The final version is going to be UAN that can be either 28% or 32%. 28%, the reason we make 28% is it actually has a salt out temperature of 0 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas 32 actually can't go below 32 degrees before the nitrogen starts salting out and basically you get junk on the bottom of the tank. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darren to cover nitrogen losses. Again, if you want CCA credits, make sure you type your first and last name and your CCA number into that chat feature. And I'd prefer it if you sent me that privately, so you can go into the chat feature and find my name and send it to me. But make sure you get that sent, or you will not get any credit for this meeting here. Okay, I had a question on what have I seen with Pivot Bio. In general, guys, the Pivot Bio product's been around for a couple years. The most that I've seen with it is 4 to 5 bushels, and that's at maybe a 40 to 50% response rate. So I haven't seen very good results with those type of products. We actually have one that's somewhat similar to that as well, if you guys want to try it. But I haven't seen very consistent results with those products. So go ahead.
All right, should we get rolling?
Yep.
On nitrogen. Hey, well, good morning, everybody. So kind of continuing on from the nitrogen addition topic, we'll discuss some of these major loss pathways. Tyler talked about additions. We'll spend just a fraction of time talking about immobilization, but we'll mainly focus on some of these other ones down here. Leaching, denitrification will be a major focus, and then we'll also talk about volatilization. Why do we see, or what causes these different losses, and some of the things we can do to try to better manage it. So moving through it here. So immobilization, first topic. Tyler had mentioned, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that's really what's driving this. Particularly if we're going to add residue, if we have a good yielding corn crop, lots of residue, and we till it under for a period of time, that's going to tie up the nitrogen in that residue. And really it comes down to increased microbial activity. The microbes use it as a food source. They tie it up, so it's not available for crop uptake. And then as they break down that residue, and as some of those microbes start to die off, then they release that nitrogen so it's available for crop uptake again. And so that's kind of what's driving immobilization is when we have a high C to N ratio, that moves it towards immobilizing the nitrogen. Once it drops below that 25 to 1, then the nitrogen becomes available for the crop. Okay. Moving on to this next portion here, we're going to do a little demo. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we will switch our video. Okay. Can you still hear me okay? Anybody?
Yep, we got you.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna charge. We're gonna get this going here, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing. Okay, so with this, we've got our soil column set up. And what we're wanting to illustrate here is different, how the charge of nitrogen in the soil is going to impact how if it flows through or not, if the soil is able to retain it. And so we have a couple different dyes here. So for our first soil column over here on the left, this is representing nitrate. And so with the orange one here, you'll notice it's draining through. So with nitrate, we talked about it last week in that nitrate has that negative charge to it. The soil isn't able to hold on to it, and so it flows freely with the solution, the soil solution. And so it drains right on through that soil profile, okay? And so we end up with our nitrate draining on through into the tile line, okay? Our second one here, this is the blue dye represents ammonium. So ammonium, we talked about that last week as well. It has that positive charge, and so the soil has a negative charge. The soil is able to grab onto that ammonium and hold it. You'll notice the blue dye, for the most part, is being held up in that top layer in that soil column. And then our solution down here at the bottom, hopefully you can see it. Can you see it in the video there? So hopefully you can see it, that it's got a clear solution that's coming out the bottom, and so the soil is able to hold on to that nitrogen. So the last one here, this last column on the right, so it has a combination of both the ammonium and the nitrate in it, and so this is probably most representative of what we're seeing out in the field, where we'll have some ammonium in there, some nitrate, but in this example, you'll see that the soil was able to hold on to the ammonium, the blue portion, but then the nitrate flowed through freely with that solution and out of the soil profile. Okay, so it just illustrates the point of the different forms of nitrogen and how it interacts with the soil. In that the soil, it's not going to be able to hold on to the nitrate, it flows through. The ammonium, the soil is able to hold it for a period of time until the microbes get to it. The bacteria convert it over to nitrate, and then it'll flow through that soil column as well. So just a visual way to kind of show the differences there. Okay, we'll get converted back over. Right. Okay, so moving on with leaching, denitrification, we already kind of talked about some of these principles with the demo. So some of the technical aspects of leaching, the nitrate, it can move in all directions throughout the soil. It really does move with the soil solution down through the soil profile. So nitrogen, it's more subject to leaching in some of these different conditions, particularly if we're applying a lot higher rates than what the crop is going to be taking up. We leave more nitrogen in that soil profile to be susceptible to, eventually it's going to be converted over to nitrate, and then it's going to be lost as we get rains, okay? And then also, if we're not applying it at a time when the crop is there actively taking it up, then we leave the nitrogen available to those processes of the nitrogen cycle, and we see increased loss as well. So as far as movement of nitrate in particular in that soil, if we're dealing with the sandy soil, we get an inch of rain, it can move about 12 inches down in that soil. If we're dealing with a loamy soil or a heavier textured soil, it'll still move about 6 inches. So it really drives home the point that, it doesn't take much precipitation to really move that nitrogen after it's been converted to nitrate. Okay, and so some of the things we can do to help to reduce leaching, a couple of these deal with timing, as far as minimizing the time that the nitrates are there before the crop can actually use it. And then the other aspect there, using nitrification inhibitors to try to keep nitrogen in that ammonium or form that the soil can hold, keep it in that form for a longer period of time, okay? Now, as far as some of these stabilizers, where they would fit in here, and I'll show this again once we talk about urease inhibitors, but as far as nitrification inhibitors, once we apply UAN, a portion of that is in the nitrate form, 25% is in the nitrate form, and it's readily leachable. And so with the use of a nitrification inhibitor, we stop the conversion of the ammonium to the nitrate. 25% is in the ammonium form as well. And so through the use of that, we're able to stop that conversion process. Some of the different nitrification inhibitors on the market, DCD would be one. A lot of the DCD products, we're not necessarily applying them at a high enough rate to do a good job of inhibiting that conversion. And then there's other products as well. Nutrisphere would be one. The nitropyrin products, Instinct, Anserve, as well as Centuro from Coke. These all fall under this nitrification inhibitor category, okay? Main thing we're trying to do with that is maintain the nitrogen in that ammonium form for a longer period of time. And ultimately what it does is it pushes out this window of when the nitrogen is available for crop uptake. So that's this blue curve that you see here. We've pushed out that window a little bit further into the season by including a stabilizer versus the unstabilized nitrogen application, okay? Some of these on the market, the new one in the last year or so from Corteva, Instinct, Next Gen. So this is kind of an improved version of Instinct 2 and Instinct HL, where it has enhanced cold temperature handling, improved compatibility and mixing properties as well. It's got a little bit higher percentage of active ingredients, close to 26%. And so because of that, our application rate is a little bit lower, 24 to 48 fluid ounces compared to the higher application rates with Instinct 2. So one data slide that I'd like to show related to nitropyrin, this was what's called a meta-analysis. And so it's a summary of a bunch of different trials that have been done over a long period of time. This meta-analysis was done in the early 2000s. And so they summarized close to 200 studies using nitropyrin. And what they looked at is how it impacted yield and retaining nitrogen and reducing nitrogen loss. And so the general things that they found here, by using nitropyrin in these trials, on average, they saw a 7% increase in yield, a 28% increase in nitrogen retention, and then 16% reduction in nitrate loss, as well as a little over 50% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. Okay, so one topic that has come up pretty frequently over the last several years: climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and a lot of times we do focus on carbon dioxide, but actually nitrous oxide, it's a lot more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so, with including nitropyrin in that application, this is a good environmental decision to make, in that it's reducing nitrate leaching, it's reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to, from the farmer's perspective, it's increasing yield and the amount of available nitrogen that they have for their crop. Okay. I did mention Centuro, so it's got a different mode of action, that pronitrogene, compared to the nitropyrin in Instinct and N-Serve. A lot of you have probably tried this or tested it out over the last couple years. Performance appears to be very similar to N-Serve for those anhydrous applications. Some of the key differences, though, this product, it's a lot gentler on equipment. It can go directly in the tank. You don't have to apply it with a sidekick unit. And so from a handling perspective, there's some major benefits to that product. Okay, kind of moving on to denitrification, exactly what that is. So once the nitrogen has been converted over to nitrate, if we deal with warm, wet, saturated soil conditions, such as what's shown in that picture on the right, if we've got these wet pockets out in fields mid-season, in those saturated soil conditions, we tend to see increased denitrification, and that's what's shown here with the yellowing of that corn crop. So what's happening with that is we've got microbes in the soil, and once the soils become saturated, those microbes still need to find an oxygen source. And so they go to the nitrate molecule and they start peeling off the oxygens. Okay, and so you'll see, they convert it over to nitrite, then this nitric oxide, eventually nitrous oxide, and that's the greenhouse gas that I mentioned before, as well as this dinitrogen gas. Okay, and so once they've converted it to these forms, then it's susceptible to, it's pretty much a gas, and it's volatilized off. Okay, and so that's the issue in saturated soil conditions. It's a pretty quick process, can happen relatively quickly. You'll see here, even when we get in season, we're generally dealing with warmer soil temperatures. Every day in saturated soil conditions, we'd be losing 5% of our available nitrate in those conditions. So our losses can add up pretty quickly from denitrification. As far as volatilization, so the main driver for it is the urease enzyme. And so urease, it converts the nitrogen over, and eventually it'll form, if it's a surface application, it'll form ammonia, which is subject to volatilization. See some of the conditions that lead to increased volatility. If we have more residue on the soil surface, we tend to see increased amounts of urease activity in the soil. And so that would lead to increased volatilization. Higher soil pH conditions, higher winds, higher temperatures, things like that can increase volatility. So I threw this in here. I thought this was kind of interesting from a couple years ago. Even from satellites, they're able to use different sensors to scan the amount of ammonia in the atmosphere. And so this is something from a couple years ago that we saw. Went to the website to see. Some people pointed out, hey, some of these dots look like they're from Iowa area. And yeah, actually, there was one northwest Iowa, as well as you can see in the adjacent area over there, kind of the northeast part of Nebraska as well, increased amounts of ammonia. Okay, and so you can see there is a number of different hotspots around the globe where there is increased ammonia volatilization into the atmosphere. Okay, so how do we avoid this, or what can we do to reduce it? So one is with those surface applications. Timely incorporation would be key. So trying to get it incorporated within 24 to 48 hours. And if we can't do that, then including a stabilizer definitely helps. So it helps to protect that nitrogen, keep it from converting over to ammonia. So hopefully within a week or two, we catch a rain to get it incorporated. Of course, we can also till, in a lot of areas of Iowa, we don't have access to irrigation, but that would be another way to get it incorporated. So this is kind of the general conversion process as far as urea hydrolysis. Probably don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but it does show the conversion process once we've applied that urea and how it's converted over, and eventually we form ammonia, which is easily lost to the atmosphere. Okay, so that's where these urease inhibitors fit in. Okay, so they help to reduce this process, the conversion from ammonium to ammonia gas. And so the products such as Anvil, Agritane that have NBPT in them, that helps quite a bit to reduce that volatilization. Okay. Anvil, already mentioned that. So in addition to the NBPT, it does have that duramide, which is a second mode of action. Performance out of Anvil looks very similar, very comparable to Agritane. So one question that I run into in the springtime a lot of times is, could we include ATS with our application? Doesn't it provide some stabilizer properties to it? And that is true to a certain extent as far as acting to reduce volatilization of ammonia. It doesn't necessarily provide any nitrification inhibitor properties to it. This is data from Dr. Goose, North Dakota State, from several years ago. In this graph, what we want to see are high numbers on this graph. Okay, so this is the residual amount of ammonium, and you'll see the NP is nitropyrin, and so the nitropyrin or encapsulated nitropyrin provided the best performance, or kept the most available nitrogen there. DCD, you'll see performance was a little bit less with DCD, but then with ATS, it really doesn't provide any nitrification inhibition. Okay. On the flip side over here, this graph on the right with the UAN application. Now in this graph, the high numbers are bad on this graph, and so with UAN, so not stabilized, we lose a pretty decent amount of that nitrogen that was applied. We roughly cut that in half or so by including ATS. So there is some protection against volatilization, but really our best performance is when we include a true nitrogen stabilizer or a urease inhibitor. And so in this case, they included NBPT, that's the green line here. And so including Anvil, Agritane, those products with UAN application does have the best performance. Okay. We don't always see this kind of result here, but in some years it does show up out in the plots. And so in this case, it was a broadcast application of urea with Agritane up here at the top, and then without agrotane. And you see the difference in stalk quality come late season. So from a couple of years ago, this is from our Iowa demos, some data that we pulled off of that. We did go out and do the late spring nitrate test. With that particular test, the threshold was 25 part per million nitrate nitrogen. And you'll see with our different stabilizer treatments, we were able to keep our soil nitrogen levels above where they needed to be compared to the untreated check, okay? And so from nitrogen availability standpoint, they're helping out early on in the season. And then our hand yield checks at the end of the season kind of showed a similar story, okay? With this one, I will mention these were surface broadcast applications of urea. And so this instinct application here was a little bit at a disadvantage compared to some of these other ones here. But you'll notice where we did have a urease inhibitor, we did see very good performance from a yield standpoint as well. Okay, so it looks like we have 5-6 minutes or so. I did want to touch on just a couple key points around fall nitrogen applications where we're quickly approaching those, or in some cases, maybe they've already started. So when should fall N applications begin? A lot of times we use our soil temps as kind of a guideline in that we want to be around 50-degree soil temps and have those soil temperatures be trending cooler. In Iowa, that's anywhere from about the second week of October all the way through, first part of December, okay? That's kind of the average. And so looking at the soil temps, it's been relatively hot, and the soil temps will kind of trend after the air temperature. And so we're still probably sitting in the mid-60s for our soil temps, if not a little bit hotter. And so it's going to be several weeks before we hit below 50-degree soil temps. Reason why that's important is this nitrification process. When we're dealing with warm soils, it doesn't take long for the bacteria to convert the nitrogen from ammonium to nitrate, and then it's susceptible to loss. Once we get below 50-degree soil temps, we greatly slow down the work that the microbes are doing. And so we're able to keep nitrogen in that ammonium form for a longer period of time. Then over on the top right here, with the use of a nitrification inhibitor, we further extend out that time of, how long it's going to convert the nitrogen, how long it's going to take to convert the nitrogen to nitrate, okay? So 50-degree soil temps, should a stabilizer be included with the application? Thought this was interesting. This is actually John Sawyer's data from his master's degree at University of Illinois. You can see from several years ago. He looked at early applications, late applications, based on the soil temperature, and then with and without a stabilizer. And in each case where he included a stabilizer, he saw increased amounts of available nitrogen the next season. Similar data set using manure. This is Jeff Vetch up at the Wasika Research Station, where they included instinct with that manure application or had the manure by itself. And you'll see the same story here. By including instinct with it, they saw increased amounts of nitrogen in the ammonium form the next spring, okay? And then the final thing that I'll mention here, can N rates be increased rather than including a stabilizer? Answer to that is yes. However, it's probably not the best recommendation to go with, both from an economic standpoint and an environmental standpoint. So this is from Iowa State's publication, where they show for each additional 20 pounds of nitrogen that you're putting on, the black part of these bars represents the incremental benefit that you're seeing. And so the main point with this is once you've hit that economical optimal nitrogen rate, for rates applied above that, you're not necessarily seeing an economic response to those applications. And then from an environmental standpoint as well, once you get above that economical optimal nitrogen rate and you apply rates above that, you start to spike the amount of nitrates that go into the tile lines, okay? And so that's a concern as well. A final thing here, Iowa State, some of you have seen this. This is actually an interesting study here from Iowa State from a couple of years ago, where they looked at early fall manure versus late fall manure. And so that's the main comparison here. By applying it later, once those soil temps have dropped, you'll see they've increased their yield the next season. The black bars are the spring applications. Spring is best for the reasons that we talked about before. You're lining up your timing of your application better with when the crop is going to be taking it up. But certainly later applications in the fall are better than earlier. And then the other component to this is looking at a late fall manure application compared to using a stabilizer. They did in each of the years see a benefit to including that stabilizer. Same thing with that though, spring application would be best, but in the fall there is a benefit to pushing those applications later and including a stabilizer with it. So I'm not sure if we touched on this at the beginning, but kind of wrapping this together, there's a lot of things that we talked about as far as nitrogen addition, nitrogen losses. We all know it's a very important topic as far as doing a good job of managing our nitrogen. There's different resources that we have out there. Tyler talked about the field forecasting tool. Hopefully with your hybrids, you're utilizing the response to data. And this really emphasizes the point that there is quite a difference in how hybrids respond, but just drives home the point of how important nitrogen management is and how much it can impact overall crop yield. So I guess anything else to add there, Tyler, or any questions from the group?
Not that I can think of. Just make sure you get your CCA credits. So by doing that, you're going to need your first and last name and CCA number into that chat feature. And I would send it to me personally. So find Tyler in the chat feature there. I got everyone that's on there now. I have you down. So.
Yeah, so thanks everybody. We appreciate you jumping on here again this morning. Next week, I think our agenda is talking about P and K management. So we'll kind of continue on with that next week. Have a good week, everybody.
Hey, Darren, don't end the call yet.